The house where Casey and I live is about 5 years old. We watched them build it from the ground up. And the last thing they did, the very last thing, was the yard. And before it was planted, walking around the yard, I could see a lot of rocks. Our area was cornfields before it was a subdivision. The soil has a lot of clay in it, and I ruined more than one pair of shoes walking around out there when it was wet. But when the grass seed was planted, it was spread, it was sown everywhere, all over the entire lot, even the rocky spots, even the spots where there was a lot of clay and already some kind of thistle stuff growing. Spots where there was gravel from the construction trucks coming in. The grass seed went all over the place. The grass filled in nicely and pretty evenly, despite it's mostly brown and thirsty right now, maybe like your yard. But when the weather is good, the grass is mostly thick and lush and green. In those places, the soil is good. There are dead spots where animals dig or other things, or kids walk across. There are shady spots and rocky spots. There are spots where dandelions and thistle grows. And even in those spots that look mostly kind of questionable most of the time, there's still some grass that manages to grow in there from time to time. The grass in every spot in our yard is not all green and lush, but 5 years ago, the seed was sown widely and generously all over the lot, without regard or worry over what may be too rocky or have too much clay or too shady or weedy or traveled by kids or animals in later years. It was spread all over, and it all worked out. So the lead-in, thinking about the seed, and the seed I was showing to Heidi, reminding us of how that begins, is to give us some context when Jesus tells the parable a little bit later. But today, in today's reading in Matthew's Gospel, we find Jesus in Galilee, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And as we discussed in Bible study last Wednesday, the Hebrew name for this body of water is Yam Kinneret, which means, Yam is a word that means a large body of water. It can be salt water or fresh, could be a lake or a sea. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is just a large freshwater lake. It's also called Lake Tiberias. Tiberias is a city on the shore. The Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, is the lowest freshwater lake on earth, second after the Dead Sea. And the Jordan River flows in the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, from the north and out at the south. The south River Jordan being where Jesus was baptized by John. So today we're on the northern shore near a town called Capernaum, mentioned a couple of chapters ago, and Jesus hasn't moved far from there during the time since in Matthew's Gospel. And Jesus is there, and there are crowds gathered around him, as there usually were in those days. And the crowds were so numerous at this time that it made more sense for him to get into a boat and push out from the shore a little bit so the people could hear him and see him better. This parable is the first of 7 that Jesus teaches in chapter 13. And today's verses out of the lectionary are one of those you might notice that there's some verses that are taken out just because it takes away from the continuity of the story for hearing and worship together's purposes. But in those verses that come out, you could look on your own later, is where the disciples ask Jesus why he teaches using parables. I want to talk about that in a few minutes. But we know from today's reading, it tells us that Jesus went outside of the house where they had gathered and sat beside the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias. The crowds were so large, Matthew tells us, that Jesus got into a boat and pushed out a little bit so they could hear him better. Matthew said that Jesus told them many things in parables. And Jesus taught this way so the people could understand. I've mentioned before that we can find examples where Jesus teaches using things that people were familiar with, or activities people were familiar with, like farming and fishing. They didn't have handouts or PowerPoint, so he talked about plowing or hauling and fishing in a net or tending a flock. He even wrote in the dirt, you can find at one point in John's Gospel. The familiar examples of things that people knew about were ways to draw the hearers into the story. Ways that giving them definitions or patterns to memorize would not draw them in so much. Parable is a Greek word from the Greek word parabole, which means to throw alongside. And that's where we get, of course, the geometric shape, the parabola, which is an arc widening around a point. So telling the story in this way with familiar examples sort of throws an arc around the point and draws the hearer in a different way. Makes the hearer think and engage the subject more deeply, taking it to heart and allowing their lives to be informed and shaped by the lesson. It is similar to the way that Emerson describes light. He says, always identical in its composition, but it falls on a great variety of objects. And by so falling is first revealed to us not in its own form, for it is formless, but in their form. So Jesus starts with a parable about a sower who went out to sow. And some seeds fell on the path where the birds came and ate them. Others fell on rocky ground where they didn't have much soil. They came up quickly, but they were scorched by the sun and withered because the soil was too rocky for them to take root. Others fell in thorny areas, and the thorns grew up and choked the plants out. But the seeds that fell on good ground brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Jesus said this was a story for anyone that could hear it. And then he did something different than other times he tells a parable. He explains the parable. Ordinarily, he just puts it out there for the people to listen to and hear and work out. But this time he explains it as if he wants to be sure we get the meaning right. So he goes back to the beginning of the parable. When anyone hears the word, he says, the word of the kingdom, and does not understand it, then the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. What was sown on rocky ground, he said, is the one who hears the word with joy, but since there is no root, the joy does not last very long. And what fell among thorns is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and lure of wealth choke the word out, and it yields nothing. But he ends up reminding us, but that which is sown in good soil is the one who hears the word, understands it, and it bears fruit. We looked at this parable in Bible study on Wednesday and talked about what it means. And who knew that we would be using things we studied years ago in geometry or literature to help understand what Jesus' message was for us. Like, think of the parable in terms of its geometric shape. To describe how Jesus wraps the narrative around a description using familiar examples that the hearer can relate to. We're reminded that the parable is not the same as a literary allegory, a narrative in which the elements of the story all stand for something else in order to describe a concept like a moral lesson, like Pilgrim's Progress or the scarlet letter. So the lesson is not determining what the soil represents, or the seeds represent, or the birds, or the thorns. In fact, many of the parables are similes, saying that the kingdom of heaven is like, and they'll describe something else that's like the kingdom of heaven. Parables tend to not be complex, rather focusing on a single concept. So we can take Jesus at his word, saying, this is the parable of the sower. It's not about the gardener who pulls weeds or irrigates, or about the harvester. It's about the sower. Surely other functions are important to the growth and nurture of the seeds, but those are lessons for another day, for another parable. This one, Jesus says, is about the sower. So we should notice that Jesus describes what happens to the seeds that fell on the path, or the rocky soil, or among thorns, even what falls on the good soil. He describes all that. And as we can expect, the seeds that fall on good soil are the ones that bear the most fruit. But Jesus does not go back and criticize the sower for letting seeds fall on the path, or the rocky soil, or among thorns that would choke them out. Jesus describes in the verses that which are left out of today's reading, that there are those who will hear the teaching of the kingdom of heaven, but never take it to heart. Those who will shut their ears and close their eyes to the word of the prophets or teachers. But he never says not to waste your time and just talk to the ones who you think will get it. Instead, we have the image of the sower, casting the seeds out with wild abandon, not just trying to get them in the good soil, but casting them so that some might end up falling on the path, some in the rocks, and some among the thorns. The sower scatters the seeds widely, even wasting some in places that won't be productive. Just like Jesus investing his time among everyone, even tax collectors, prostitutes, and all manner of sinners, not just the good church people all the time. This generous sower gives us the freedom not to worry about identifying the good soil or the bad soil, or worry that we might drop some seeds on the path or in the briar patch. And Jesus doesn't criticize for wasting the other seeds, because don't the birds get fed? Didn't the plants that withered away eventually decompose and return to the earth? And didn't the thorns and briars prevail in order that they might feed other species or serve some other purpose, like preventing erosion? There are other parables Jesus tells that teach about tending the garden, harvesting, and distributing the crops. But this one is about the sower. The generous sower that doesn't play it safe, only sowing where there seems to be the most possibility for growth. The sower who has the vision that there's a chance, even for some of the seeds that landed on what looked like rough and questionable places. The sower that trusts others will come along to nurture what's been planted, and they can work even harder on what's rough and rocky. Henry David Thoreau wrote a chapter in Walden about his bean field. His enemies in that bean field were worms, cool weather, and woodchucks. And his auxiliaries were the dews and the rains, along with whatever fertility was already in the soil. But in the end, he said, we forget that the sun looks on our cultivated fields and on the prairies and forests without distinction. They all reflect and absorb his rays alike. In the sun's view, the earth is all equally cultivated like a garden. Therefore, we should receive the benefit of his light and heat with a corresponding trust and magnanimity. These beans, he says, have results which are not harvested by me. Do they not grow for the woodchucks partly? The ear of wheat should not only be the hope of the cultivator, should not be the only hope of the cultivator. Its kernel or grain is not all that it bears. How then can our harvest fail? Shall I not rejoice also at the abundance of the weeds, whose seeds are the granary of the birds? It matters little comparatively whether the fields fill the farmer's barns. The true farmer will cease from anxiety and finish his labor with every day, relinquishing all claim to the produce of his fields and sacrificing in his mind not only his first, but his last fruits also. The work of the sower has been done with generosity in every place. The parable is about what God has done. Seeds sown generously on all conditions of the earth. Even sowing where growth may happen long after we're gone. So let us take the word of the kingdom to heart and live in that same generosity. Our responsibility is showing God's love in how we live our lives. So then, may it be with us.